Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a list of 25 very popular books that currently are free through the service Scribd. This video is not sponsored. I just thought it was really incredible when I saw that this streaming service was offering their entire library for free, given everything that's going on at the time that I'm filming this. So I wanted to go through and find a bunch of really popular books that a lot of people are interested in, and then let you all know that you have access to these for free for 30 days. I checked at the time that I'm doing this and it's still going on. But if you happen to come across this video later and they're no longer offering the service for free, it is only $8.99, so it's still quite affordable. But going ahead and jumping into it, the very first one would be the Red Rising trilogy by Pierce Brown. This is a science fiction series, takes place in the far future. There's a caste system based on colors, but it goes beyond that. People who belong to specific colors also tend to have physical traits that are different, and our main character is part of a group that is oppressed, and he has the opportunity to kind of break the color system down. Next up would be Crown of Feathers and its sequel, Heart of Flames by Nikki Pau-Preto. It follows a group of rebels that ride phoenixes, which I think is so cool. It's got a lot of politicking, and I think our main character, Veronica, is definitely a character that you really want to root for. Next up would be Gardens of the Moon. This is the first book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series by Steven Erikson. I have only read the first book in the series. I'm currently reading the second. It is known for being incredibly dense, and its fandom swears that the more you read in this series, that the better it is. If you're a fan of video games like Bloodborne and Dark Souls, I feel like this is the book series equivalent. Next up, we have A Curse So Dark and Lonely. This is a young adult. It's a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. It's a portal fantasy, which means our main character actually lives in our world, and then she gets thrust into a more medieval type world where there's a curse on a prince, and they need somebody to help them break this curse. Next up, we have a bit of a booktube darling. That would be The Shades of Magic by V.E. Schwab. It's a very unique premise. We follow a character who has the ability to go between parallel worlds, specifically parallel Londons, and while London is essentially the same in each of these worlds, the worlds outside of London are very different, and they're kind of color-coded, and it's very interesting and very unique, and the story gets going when our main character, Kel, takes something from one London into another that he was not supposed to. It's a bit of a slow start, but once it gets going, it's kind of race to the finish line. Next up, we have the first book in the Seven Realms series by Cinda Williams-Chima. This is a slightly older young adult fantasy series, and I think that the first book, it's definitely a lot of setup for the series as a whole, but the series is very connected. We follow one character who's she's trying to ensure that she has claim to her throne, while another character is kind of a street rat who ends up being involved in politics. Next up, we have Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. This probably needs no introduction. It is a very popular adult fantasy story, and we follow a man who is telling his life story. It's a bit meandering given the nature of it. I actually personally don't love Name of the Wind, but I wanted to include it because so many people do, and it's a favorite for so many people. If you've wanted to check this out, Scribd has it. Next up would be the Shadow of the Fox series by Julie Kagawa. This is a Japanese-inspired fantasy story that follows two main characters, Yumeko and Tatsumi. The third one was just released, and it was such a roller coaster of emotions. These books follow these two main characters as they are paired up to complete a mission. Every 1,000 years, there is a wish that can be granted to someone, and often the person that it's granted to wants it for not very good reasons. They want to use this wish for selfish reasons, for evil reasons, and so these characters are essentially trying to ensure that nobody evil gets access to this wish that is coming up. The character dynamics are so wonderful. Next, 3 books on this list are all by the author Brandon Sanderson, and they are Warbreaker, Rhythmatist, and then the second era Mistborn books. Brandon Sanderson, I would say, is mostly known for the Stormlight Archive and Mistborn, and they don't have those currently on Scribd, but Warbreaker, I think, is one of his most underrated adult fantasy stories. We follow these two sisters, one who is meant to fulfill a marriage alliance, and the other who's carefree and has never really had to worry about anything. And then they sort of pull a parent trap and switch places, not of their own will. It's kind of something their father puts on them. But then the sister who was supposed to fulfill this alliance, she ends up deciding, oh, I have to rescue my sister, and she has no idea what she's doing. And then the other one doesn't know what she's doing because she's never been groomed for this. And it is there's so much charisma in this story. It's so charming and the characters are funny, but the stakes are really high. It's currently a standalone. It's one that I end up mentioning on every recommendations list, and Scribd has it. The Arithmetist is actually a middle grade young adult story that follows a character who doesn't have any magic, but he absolutely is obsessed with the magic in their world, and their world is like our world, but with an alternate history and geography. It's very interesting, and I found it to be fascinating. The magic system has to do with chalk and drawings and shapes, and it was really unique. And just like WARBREAKER, I think it's incredibly underrated for Sanderson. I'm so glad they have it. The second era Mistborn books, you do have to read the first era, and when I checked, they don't have first era Mistborn available, but if you have read first era and you've been wanting to pick up second era, you can do that. Next up would be Sarah J. Maas. They have the Throne of Glass book available on Scribd, and then the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. I believe they had the entire series on audiobooks. The A Court of Thorns and Roses series is very romance heavy. I'm not the biggest romance fan, but if you're somebody who likes fantasy but you really like romance, you will probably love this series. It's also a Beauty and the Beast retelling. The first one is, at least. Throne of Glass, I've read the first 3. I never continued on, but I would definitely give this series another go. It is slightly more youthful in tone. I wouldn't say it's incredibly serious, and there's definitely a lot of romance within the series, but I would say it's more fantasy driven than the A Court of Thorns and Roses series is, and it's definitely less explicit than the other one is. You follow a girl who used to be the most respected assassin, and then she was captured, and now she has an opportunity to get her freedom, and then when she has this opportunity, she's discovering that there's a lot more going on with politics than she realized, and she's kind of determined to claim her power again. Next up, we have Theft of Swords by Michael J. Sullivan. A little while back, I did a video of fun fantasy book recommendations, so fantasy books that are just a good old time, that aren't too serious, and I think that Theft of Swords is definitely that. It is kind of a bromance story. You've got these two guys who are the best of friends, and they just kind of have to work together to tackle whatever comes their way. So it's definitely a great one for if you're just wanting something a little bit more lighthearted. Next up, we have the science fiction story, The Lunar Chronicles. I've read all but the last one in this series, and they are retellings of popular stories. The first one is Cinder, so it's a retelling of Cinderella. Then you have Scarlet, which is like Little Red Riding Hood, and so on. And they build upon each other. So the first one, you just follow this Cinderella type character who is kind of a nobody. She's a cyborg, and society doesn't really like cyborgs, but then she is involved with some dangers that are coming at our world. And then from there, you start to see these other fairy tale characters that get introduced and end up being involved in this same plot. Next up, we have Queen of the Tearling by Erica Johansson. You follow this character that on her birthday, she now has to come out of hiding and claim her throne, and right away from the very beginning, there's assassins sent after her. People who are supposed to be allies seem to actually be enemies, and she is so strong-willed. She's also flawed, but man, you just root for her, and she's always determined to do the right thing. Next up, we have the book Scythe by Neil Shusterman. This is a story that is sort of very futuristic, where we have conquered death, but the only threat left to mankind is overpopulation. So mankind's very stupid solution to this problem is to just have there be a group of revered individuals whose occupation is to just go around and kill people. Despite such a morbid setup, I actually think that these books have a lot of humor in them. Almost one of those, you have to have that so that it doesn't become too dark, but I also think there's a lot of what it means to be alive type things presented in this story, which I really like. It doesn't come across pretentious at all to me, which I think you can definitely slip into with this kind of a setup. When I looked, I believe the book is available on Scribd, but I think the audiobook is in German or something. So I don't think you can get the audiobook, but you can get the ebook. Next up, we have Vicious and Vengeful by V. Schwab. She's making another appearance on this list. This particular story takes place in our world. It's definitely adult. There's some pretty dark content in this story, but we follow multiple characters who they used to be best friends, and then something happened and now they hate each other. And it's a split timeline. You don't really know what happened, but you are piecing that together as the book progresses. It's not just past and present. It's 2 weeks before, 1 day before, 5 years ago. It has this crazy split timeline. It's really entertaining. And if you like morally gray characters, it's that in excess. When I looked, I think the first book, Vicious, is available as an ebook, and then the second one's available as an audiobook. So just a heads up, don't know if that's going to be the case when you guys look by the time you see it, but that's what it was when I looked. The next 2 books are both by the author Margaret Rogerson. They would be An Enchantment of Ravens and Sorcery of Thorns. They're both standalones. They are not a part of a series. They're their own stories. And An Enchantment of Ravens follows a girl who is a painter. She's often commissioned by Fae because the Fae don't have the ability to create things themselves. So they commission her, this kind of child prodigy, young adult prodigy, a painter, to paint their portraits. And one day she does something that irks one of the Fae, and then he insists on bringing her back to his kingdom to basically be put on trial. And along the way, there's a lot of things that they encounter. It's very sweet story, and it's a little bit of a love story. It's kind of a sweet love story. Sorcery of Thorns is less romantically driven, and it's more fantasy driven. So we follow a girl who her dream is to basically become the protector of these magical books called grimoires. These books, if handled wrong, they can become monsters, so that's why they need these people to protect them. This is her dream, but things go terribly wrong in her life when she gets blamed for one of these books becoming a monster and doing a lot of damage, and now she's kind of on the run. She's trying to figure out what actually happened and why she's being blamed for it, and there's a lot of chaos that ensues. Next on this list is All the Light We Cannot See. This is historical fiction, and I would argue it's actually historical fiction and magical realism. I must say it's one of the best written books I think I've ever read. It follows these 2 characters during World War II, one who is essentially recruited into the German forces, and then the other character is a blind girl whose father just worked at a museum. They've been displaced from their homes. They're kind of on the run. And you follow these 2 individuals from childhood on into their teenage years. It's a very tragic story. It's very heavy. But the reason that I actually personally didn't love it, despite thinking it was very fantastically written, was the magical realism aspects. But most people really like the symbolism involved with those things. It's definitely a very powerful story, and if you're looking for a good historical fiction read, you're probably gonna love it. The last 5 things on this list I have not actually read, but I still wanted to let you know that they are available because they're very popular and you might be interested in them. The first 2 are just authors that you can find multiple works of theirs on Scribd. One would be Neil Gaiman, and one would be Stephen King. I also saw The Hobbit available, and I believe The Silmarillion is also available on Scribd, so if you're a huge fan of Lord of the Rings, you can check those out. There's also The Road by Cormac McCarthy, which does have an adaptation, but it's kind of a post-apocalyptic story with a very interesting writing style. Cormac McCarthy's kind of known for that. And lastly, kind of keeping on trend with these last 5 having adaptations of some sort, we have The Handmaid's Tale. I've actually never checked this out. I know it's kind of hit or miss for some people, but it's very popular. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. I hope all of you are doing well, and I'll see you guys later.